In the wild world of 1970s hockey, there was a man who didn't want to face when the gloves were dropped. He had the best nickname in the league and a reputation that made even the game's wildest enforcers think twice. By the time he finally cracked the NHL as a 27-year-old rookie, he was already a legend in the minors. In fact, he was the one player Don Cherry absolutely insisted on having when he built his first roster from scratch. In this episode, we'll first dive into the career of this Pittsburgh Penguins legend who proved he could play as well as punish. We'll also see why he once called his Penguins teammates a bunch of chickens. And we'll see how he refused to allow his coaches to turn him into a goon. Now, we'll also share two more stories of enforcers of that era in my personal interactions with a man who once punched out his coach and another who almost got punched out by an opposing coach. You're watching the Pro Hockey Alumni channel, where we take a close look at the legends of hockey's golden era of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Anchors away. One of five boys from an Irish Catholic family, Bob Kelly grew up in Fort William, Ontario, a hard-nosed mill town that would later become part of Thunder Bay. He dropped out of school at age 16 and took a job in a local paper mill. Now, for young Bob, it was 3 years of shift work, heat, steel, and sweat. He actually quit junior hockey for over 2.5 seasons over a dispute over skates. And for a while, he focused on football, and he was talented enough to be invited by the CFL Saskatchewan Roughriders to their training camp. Now, instead, he returned to junior hockey with the Port Arthur Mars and helped them to a Memorial Cup appearance in 1967. Although they'd eventually lose to the Toronto Marlboros, he caught the eye of Toronto Maple Leaf scouts. The Leafs oddly passed on drafting a player in round 1, but chose Kelly in round 2. Bob's road to the NHL would take some time, though, being first assigned to the Port Huron Flags of the IHL for the 67-68 season. There in 65 games, Kelly scored 11 goals and 26 assists to serve notice of his toughness with 216 penalty minutes. Fans loved him. He divided the following season between Port Huron and the Columbus Checkers, but remarkably in 59 games, he was whistled for only 55 penalty minutes. Kelly spent the next 2 seasons with the AHL's Providence Reds, the first of which was 1969-70, that saw him score but 2 goals and 7 points, and his penalty minute dropped to just 28 minutes. Now, despite this lack of ice time and production, he once again became a fan favorite and earned the nickname Battleship. Now, halfway through his second season with Providence, the 6'2", 195-pound Kelly was dealt to the Des Moines Oak Leafs back in the IHL. It appeared his career was moving backwards. Then a remarkable thing happened. In 71-72, Battleship Bob Kelly found his offensive game, scoring 26 goals in 55 games, equaling his total for the entire career up to that season. He accomplished this while being a physical force, racking up 124 penalty minutes in 55 games with the IHL Oak Leafs. Meanwhile, none other than Don Cherry had been named GM and coach of the AHL Rochester Americans. Cherry began the job with 0 players on the roster. He had just one request of ownership: get me Battleship Bob Kelly. And Kelly was at the New York Rangers training camp at that time.
Like that. So I got it, and I said to Dennis Ball, who was a chief scout of New York Rangers, I said, I would like Battleship Kelly. He says, no, you can't have him. He's going to Baltimore. I was tell you, talk about disappointed. Nothing I can do. He's supposed to go to Baltimore. I think they were called Baltimore Skipjacks or something like that. So I'm home. I'm doing the best I can. And I remember I got a call from Dennis. I'll never forget this as long as I live. He said, would you like Battleship Kelly? I actually danced on the end of the phone. I knew I had it made when I got Battleship Kelly. So he says, well, he's in Toronto right now. How would you like to get him back? I said, I will go and bring him piggyback to get him here. So I got him back there, and was I happy, I'll tell you. And I said, when he got there, I mean, he'd been kicking around in the minor leagues, Port Huron, Des Moines, and everything. I said, if you listen to me, you'll be in the National Hockey League next year. And yeah. And I said, oh, listen to me, and you'll be in the National Hockey League next year. Well, he did listen to me. To make a long story short, he got 27 goals. I'll tell you how tough he was. This is how tough he was. I was watching the warm-ups, and we shot the pucks. We lost all the pucks went in the crowd. He actually went down, pushed the other team's goaltender out of the way, and took the pucks out of the net, and nobody did a thing. And I remember we used to do the national anthem. We used to be faced in some way, and he used to tape his – in those days, you could tape your hands. Well, he'd tape his hands, and I'd have him not a spotlight on him, but the light used to be on him. He used to take his gloves off, and he was patting his hair down, and you'd see these great big. I mean, he had the longest arms, the biggest fist I ever saw. I mean, he did. Listen, he got 27 goals in 70 games. And I remember we bought him for $7,500. I told the owners, I said, $7,500, buy him. $7,500. We ended up selling him back for $20,000. They made $13,000, and we got another good player out of it called Billy Nibs.
Kelly was everything Don Cherry had hoped for, scoring 27 goals for the Americans and racking up 206 penalty minutes. Kelly famously taped his fists like a prize fighter and cracked his knuckles during the national anthems. Of all the fights in Amerks history, one stands out. November 17, 1972, the night Kelly demolished Cincinnati's Jake Rathwell at Rochester's War Memorial. While racing for the puck, Rathwell made the mistake of jabbing the blade of his stick into Kelly's mouth. Quote, "God help the guy who does that," recalls Kelly. "I just went ballistic." Kelly beat Rathwell to a pulp, but the two resumed battling in the penalty box and police had to pull Kelly off. But he may have topped that 2 weeks later in a brawl with one of hockey's toughest players, Kevin Morrison of the New Haven Blades.
And in the old days, when two tough guys would meet, they met at center ice, and it was like a gunfight at OK Corral. They both dropped their gloves. Now the linesman and the referee, they formed a circle around the outside. It was like something, the light was shining down, and they had a beauty at center ice you couldn't believe. I'd have to say Battleship won. He never lost a fight, never saw him lose a fight. It was terrific. But the only time I've ever seen the ref and the referee put their whistles in their pocket and watch the fight. And I never forgot that one. Another thing that happened there as I go along, in New Haven, the armrests that the fans used to sit in, they hadn't glued them in yet. They were throwing them on the ice. You couldn't believe they were picking them up and throwing them on the ice. Well, I grabbed Bob Kelly's arm and put it in the air, and believe it or not, he skated around with going like that, antagonized the fans.
Those fights in Rochester earned Kelly a big reputation in his first shot at the NHL when he became a member of the St. Louis Blues in 1973, and that was a team badly in need of his muscle. As a 27-year-old rookie, Kelly quickly established his reputation in the NHL with two clear-cut decisions with Philadelphia's Dave the Hammer Schultz during an exhibition game in the fall of '73. Kelly notes that the Hammer would have been a cement head to try for a third time. After the destruction of Schultz, word of Battleship's fighting prowess spread throughout the league like wildfire. Meanwhile, the St. Louis Brass, who was also grooming the likes of John Wensink, Bob Gassoff, and Steve Durbano as future enforcers, made it clear to Kelly that he wasn't in the NHL to score goals. In November 1973, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch carried a small feature on Kelly in which he was quoted as saying that he was being told to start fights with certain opponents. He stated, quote, "I can play the game of hockey as well as anyone in the Blues. But I thought if all I'm going to do is be a goon, I might as well hang up my skates. I'm here as a hockey player, not as a heavyweight champion." The Blues were unimpressed with Kelly's self-restraint. And midway through the season, he was traded to Pittsburgh with Ab DeMarco and Steve Durbano. Kelly had scored 9 goals and 8 assists in 37 games, but with only 45 penalty minutes, he was said to not have been playing tough enough to satisfy the St. Louis Brass. Kelly was not happy with the trade. He had just settled his family in St. Louis and was particularly upset at having to pull his young daughter out of school. Not long after he arrived in Pittsburgh, he again talked to the Post-Dispatch writer, and he stated, quote, "The Blues are trying to turn Wensink into a goon, just like they tried to do with me. I told them if they wanted a fighter, go hire a boxer. They just wanted to use me as a dummy. They told me to go, quote, go get this guy and go get that guy." But he gained instant folk hero status in Pittsburgh when the Penguins first demolished the Philadelphia Flyers. Then they beat the Blues with Kelly taking on villain Barclay Plager in a big post-trade grudge match. Sparked by the fights, the Penguins won that game 4-1. Named co-number 1 stars, Durbano and Kelly emerged side by side from the runway leading from the locker room. Flushed with emotion and a shared moment of glory, Durbano grabbed Kelly's sleeve and hoisted his pal's left arm in triumph. The crowd went wild. Tough hockey had at long last arrived in the Steel City. Kelly was the guy who took care of everybody, former Pens teammate Rick Keogh recalled. He was our enforcer. Now, Civic Arena organist Vince Lashide was quick to capitalize on Kelly's popularity, playing anchors away whenever Kelly scored. In Pittsburgh, Kelly proved he could play. Although an average skater, he possessed a hard slap shot and put it to good use, patrolling the left wing on a line with phenom center Pierre LaRouche and hard-shooting Chuck Arneson. He netted 27 goals in 74-75 and 25 more the following year. Now, during that infamous 7-game 1975 playoff series loss to the New York Islanders, Battleship was the Penguins' best player, pacing the club with 5 goals and 8 points. Kelly was a remarkably infrequent fighter during his 3+ years in Pittsburgh, due in no small part to his intimidating presence. Sporting a wild shock of curly hair, a Fu Manchu mustache, and a Clint Eastwood-like demeanor, Kelly oozed silent menace. Quote, "I don't go into a game looking for a fight because I don't have to prove myself in a league anymore," he explained. "But if the other team wants to get rough, well, I'll get rough too." And in that spirit, Kelly recalled that after engaging in 2 brutal fights with Boston's Terry O'Reilly, the pair went out to lunch the next day. Now, here you see Kelly in action versus Boston's Hank Nowak.
Nowak back on. Takes a hit from Kelly. They both go down. The puck driven out. And back to the Boston end. And here's Nowak and Kelly going at it. Hank Nowak and Kelly. And down goes Nowak. And takes a hit. Hard right from Kelly, rated one of the best fighters in the league. Nowak and Kelly. A rugged battle. Kelly is a tremendous fighter. Solid reputation, one of the best in the NHL.
A former teammate, Harvey Bennett, marveled at the respect opposing players afforded Kelly. Quote, "It's like Kelly skates with a big glass dome around him," Bennett told the Pittsburgh Press. "Nobody wants to touch him. He can stand in the crease and not get hit. He doesn't get any cheap shots." Occasionally, an opposing gunslinger would test Kelly, with painful results. Feisty defenseman from Chicago, Keith Magnuson, engaged Battleship in a toe-to-toe scrap that was incapacitated for 4 weeks. A Kelly uppercut dislodged the helmet of Toronto battler Dave Tiger Williams and sent the helmet flying into the air. Following 2 strong seasons with the Penguins, Kelly dipped to just 10 goals in 76-77. And at this point, few players around the NHL wanted to challenge Kelly, so he didn't fight much. So with his free agency looming in 1977, Penguins owner Albert A. Seville said he wanted Kelly on the team, but not the Kelly of the previous 2 seasons. Instead, the owner wanted Kelly the fighter. And meanwhile, Kelly publicly lashed out at his soon-to-be former teammates. Quote, "I got jumped from behind in 3 fights at the beginning of last season and got no help from anybody. They're a bunch of chickens. There are only about 3 guys on the whole bloody team you can count on, and half the time you're on the ice by yourself. These guys wouldn't even grab a hold of anybody during a fight." Incidentally, I've talked to some of Kelly's Penguins teammates over the years, and one in particular disagreed with Kelly's criticism. In fact, he didn't feel like Kelly was holding up his end of the fighting responsibilities. Anyway, with his gripes about the Penguins off his chest, Kelly signed a 2-year deal with the Chicago Blackhawks in 1977. But his production tanked in 2 injury-plagued seasons. When called upon, he could still throw them. Take a look at this battle with Boston's John Wensink, which is probably Don Cherry's dream matchup.
And here is Kelly knocked down by Wensink, and this could be a good goal. Wensink and Bob Kelly. And Wensink is pulling his hair, and that could be a problem. That could be an added penalty as Kelly fires away at Wensink. And Kelly getting extra blows in. Now Wensink crashes it with a heavy right as he breaks away from it. But hair pulling is not allowed, and Wensink might be called on that. Wensink throwing a right at Kelly. These are 2 battling heavyweights, and Wensink gets him down. And now separated by the linesman.
Got to give the edge to Wensink on that one. However, with the hair pulling penalty, we're going to have to call that battle a draw. Either way, a lot of heavy punches landed. Now, Kelly failed to try out with the Edmonton Oilers in 1979, and he retired. Became a successful amateur coach and remained in the USA for several years. In recent years, he has earned decisions over another foe, cancer. In fact, he says he was down to about 130 pounds at one point, and the prognosis was not good. But he survived these battles, and he recovered. In 2018, he received what he calls his greatest honor in hockey when he was inducted into the Northwest Ontario Hockey Hall of Fame. Now, before we head into our second story, let me know what you think of Battleship Bob Kelly? Was he hockey's toughest fighter in the 1970s? And if not, who was? Just the other day out of the blue, I get a call and the ID on my phone says, from Shediac, New Brunswick. It can only be one man. That's Gordy Machine Gun Gallant. And I had fun talking with him about the career that he has. Certainly a colorful character, one of the most colorful characters of the World Hockey Association. But I remember 1975, I was in middle school, we had a letter writing lesson in English class. So we had to compose a letter to somebody and, envelope and stamp and the whole process. So our class could choose whoever we wanted to send a letter to. So people would send to the mayor of our Worcester, Massachusetts, or they would to the governor or to the president or company heads or things like that. I chose Gordy Gallant of the Minnesota Fighting Saints to write my letter to ask for an autograph. And of course, my teachers were like, who the hell is Gordy Gallant? What is the Minnesota Fighting Saints? What the heck is the World Hockey Association? Anyway, I did, and I got the autograph back. Right around that time, April 1975, Gordy and the Minnesota Fighting Saints would take on the New England Whalers in the first round of the WHA playoffs. They got to the hotel, and all heck broke loose from there. From that time, they arrived at the hotel to the end of the hockey game. Here's that story.
On April 9, 1975, it would be the last game Gallant would play that season. The next night was an off night, and according to Gallant, quote, "We met a few ladies, had a few bottles of wine, and the next thing you know, we look at our watches. Uh-oh, missed curfew." On April 11, 1975, the Fighting Saints and the Whalers would engage in the infamous Brawl in the Mall in Hartford. But Gallant missed the fun. He was already on a plane heading back to St. Paul. We'll let his coach Harry Neal tell the story.
We were going to play the first game of the playoffs against the Hartford Whalers, and I had a curfew because I knew we had a very explosive team on the ice and off. So I said, be in by midnight, and I started calling the rooms. And Mike McMahon, our defenseman, roomed with Gordy Gallant, and he said, Gordy's not here. About an hour and a half later, Mike McMahon phones and says, Gordy came in and he's pissed off, and he's coming up to see you.
A lot of things happened, and that led up to a lot of things, and last night I was out 45 minutes late from curfew. I was late, and I was in the wrong. I went up to see Mr. Neal, and I exploded,
10 seconds later, we hear the knock at the door, and I'm rooming with Jack McCartan, my assistant coach, and Jack's saying, don't answer the door. And it's Gordy yelling at me, and I said, come on, we've never had any trouble with Gordy Gallant before. So I open the door, and I'm in my underwear and no shirt, and I open the door, whack, he suckers me.
I heard the door open, and I heard splat. There was Harry on his hands and knees bleeding, and there was Gallant in the doorway. So then him and I got into it.
And the next thing I know, I'm outside, Gordy's inside, and I hear Jack McCartan yelling, help, Harry! And the furniture was going wild. Jack was fighting with him.
Gallant was gone the next morning.
I don't think you can build a franchise out of fear, and I don't think any one individual can put himself ahead of the coach or the team of the franchise, and therefore a decision had to be made.
I actually had another interaction with Gordy. That was in 1977. The New England Whalers faced off against the Birmingham Bulls in Hartford, Connecticut, and reached over the glass and got Gordy's autograph here, the second autograph of Gordy Gallant that I have. Also on here is Paul Henderson and Mark Napier, among others, and Dale Hoganson and Wayne Wood on the front. Anyway, my point is that back in those days, you had to use your imagination. We've talked about it before. I listened to a lot of the WHA games on the radio. You'd read the hockey news, hockey magazines. I had this vision of Gordy Gallant being about 6'3" and 200 pounds. And then I reached over the glass, and he was just a little guy. He looked like about 5'9" or so, wiry, strong, tough as nails, but certainly made the most of the size that he had because he was one of the smaller players on the ice. Speaking of the Birmingham Bulls and the WHA, I've got another story to tell, which has some personal involvement. In the last video that we did, which has got a lot of views, was about Steve Durbano. Now, one of those fights that we showed was a fight against the Houston Aeros' Terry Raskowski. Now, I have a little story about that personally. I was working for the Hartford Whalers at the time. So you can imagine this. I've got in my office, I've got to the right of me, Gordie Howe, literally in our office. We worked for us at the time. To the left of me, I've got Emil Francis in hockey operations. You can imagine the stories those two would tell, often in my office. But right across the hall from me was Frank Paul Nazick, the WHA historian / statistician. So one summer day, slow summer day in the NHL, I noticed a kind of a cubbyhole in Frank's office, and he had forgotten about it. He goes, and I said, "What's in there?" I said, "I don't know." I said, "Well, I'm going to go check it out." So I crawl into the through the dust and the cobwebs and things like that, and I come upon these reel-to-reel tapes that actually had been sent to the WHA offices. And in this one in particular was sent to the WHA offices for a suspension assessment of Steve Durbano. And it was for this fight against Terry Ruskowski. Now, I thought originally it was because the referee got hit twice by Durbano. But actually, it was about, if you see here in the scrum, Durbano gouging the eyes of Terry Ruskowski. Now, this so incensed Bill Foxy Dineen. It's a classy, kind of a low-key guy who's a coach of the Houston Aeros. That when this game ended, he charged back in the Birmingham locker room to take a swing at Durbano, which may not have ended real well for him, but he went and did it anyway. However, Durbano had already exited. So Dineen literally took a cab and had him taken to every bar room in Birmingham that he thought Durbano may be hanging out at, just to confront him for doing that to Ruskowski. And unfortunately, I should say fortunately for Bill and for Durbano and everybody involved, he never did find him. As a result of this tape, by the way, Durbano was suspended for the fourth and final time in the World Hockey Association with the Birmingham Bulls. I've also got one more story. I'm going to throw a bonus in there too. Back we did the video on Rick Blight, we talked about Hilliard Graves and how Hilliard Graves kind of set in motion the end of Rick's career. Now, Hilliard Graves was a guy who I would say was the most hated player of the 1970s among the players. Certainly the player that people hated playing against the most. The reason is he would just come in like a kamikaze out of nowhere and just he hit you low, take your knees out, and he hurt a lot of guys. He put a lot of guys out of commission, sometimes permanently, sometimes for extended periods of time. So I have to be researching this story on Bob Kelly I was doing today, and I happened upon a game against the Atlanta Flames, which Graves played. Now, this clip may not mean much to you, but it's kind of just symbolized what it was like playing against this guy. And you can see here we set it up. Don Ari has the puck coming out of his own end for Pittsburgh, and here comes Hilliard Graves.
Now Dennis Ochard to Don Ori. And the Pens will try to get a line change here. By Anchin as Ori is spilled by Graves.
So just a dangerous guy to play against. I really expand upon more about this in the Rick Blight feature. Thanks so much for watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the players we covered in today's episode. Let's have our usual excellent discussion in the comments section below. And speaking of the comments, I do read them all, and I appreciate the contributions of what I consider to be the most knowledgeable hockey fans here on YouTube. Now, if you enjoyed this look back at some of hockey's most notorious players of the 1970s, check out this video of another legend of hockey's golden era.
Really can handle himself. Kelly also with that reputation. This training, high ball,